The morning sun cast long shadows across the busy shopping district of Manchester as Margaret Thompson carefully made her way down the crowded sidewalk. At 78 years old, she moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had learned that rushing through life often meant missing its most important moments. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and despite her modest clothing, there was something dignified about her presence that commanded quiet respect from those who bothered to notice. Margaret had been visiting this particular street for over 30 years, watching as small family businesses gave way to chain stores and trendy boutiques. Today she was looking for a simple birthday gift for her granddaughter. Nothing fancy, just something thoughtful that would bring a smile to the young woman's face. The area had changed dramatically since she first started coming here, but she still enjoyed the energy and diversity of the neighborhood. As she approached Henderson's department store, a mid-sized establishment that had been operating for nearly 2 decades, Margaret noticed the usual hustle and bustle of afternoon shoppers. The store had a reputation for decent prices and helpful staff, though she had heard whispers recently about changes in management and a shift in the store's atmosphere. Some of the older customers had mentioned that the service wasn't quite what it used to be, but Margaret preferred to form her own opinions rather than rely on neighborhood gossip. Inside the store, Marcus Williams was having what he considered to be the worst day of his retail career. At 26 years old, he had been working as a senior sales associate at Henderson's for just over 8 months, and he was convinced that he deserved better than dealing with what he saw as demanding customers and unrealistic expectations. His supervisor had called in sick, leaving him effectively in charge of the main sales floor, a responsibility that he felt was beneath his capabilities and aspirations. Marcus had always believed that retail work was temporary for him, just a stepping stone to something bigger and more prestigious. He had a business degree from a local college and dreams of working in corporate management, far removed from the daily grind of folding clothes and handling customer complaints. His attitude had grown increasingly bitter over the past few months, especially toward customers he perceived as difficult or time-consuming. The store was experiencing its typical afternoon rush, with customers browsing through racks of clothing, families with children creating their usual chaos, and the steady hum of conversation filling the air. Marcus watched from behind the main counter, his expression growing more irritated with each passing minute. He had already dealt with 3 returns, 2 complaints about sizing, and a customer who had insisted on examining what felt like every item in the women's accessories section before leaving without purchasing anything. When Margaret entered the store, she took a moment to orient herself and decide which section might have appropriate gifts for a 22-year-old university student. The layout had been reorganized since her last visit, and she found herself slightly confused by the new arrangement. She approached the information desk where Marcus was stationed, hoping to get some friendly guidance about where to find what she was looking for. "Excuse me?" Margaret said politely, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone who had been well-educated in her youth. "I'm looking for a nice scarf or perhaps a handbag for my granddaughter. Something suitable for a young lady at university. Could you point me in the right direction?" Marcus barely looked up from the inventory sheet he was pretending to study. "Scarves are over there," he said with a dismissive wave toward the back of the store. "Handbags are on the other side. You'll figure it out." Margaret was taken aback by the curt response, but decided to give the young man the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps he was having a difficult day, or maybe he was new and still learning how to interact with customers. She had raised 3 children and worked with young people for most of her career, so she understood that everyone had bad days and deserved patience. "Thank you," she replied graciously. "I don't suppose you could show me. I'm not familiar with the new layout, and I want to make sure I'm looking at items appropriate for someone her age." This time Marcus did look up, and his expression made it clear that he found her request annoying. "Lady, I'm busy with important stuff here. You've got eyes, don't you? Walk around and look. That's what shopping is." Several other customers had begun to notice the interaction, and Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. She had always prided herself on treating service workers with respect and kindness, remembering her own younger days when she had worked various jobs to support her family. She had never expected such rudeness in return, especially not for such a simple and reasonable request. "I understand you're busy," Margaret said, maintaining her composure despite feeling hurt and confused. "But I'm a paying customer and I would appreciate just a moment of your time to help me find what I'm looking for. Surely that's part of what customer service means." Marcus's face darkened and he stepped out from behind the counter. His voice rose loud enough for half the store to hear. "Look, old woman, I don't have time to hold your hand and walk you around like you're a child. This isn't a personal shopping service. You want something, go find it yourself. And if you don't like the way we do things here, there's the door." The store had grown noticeably quieter, with shoppers stopping their browsing to stare at the unfolding scene. Margaret stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened. In all, her years of shopping, working, and interacting with people from every walk of life, she had never been spoken to with such blatant disrespect. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the shock of encountering such unnecessary cruelty. "I see," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the hurt she felt. "I suppose I'll look around on my own then." As Margaret walked away, from the counter, several customers approached her with expressions of sympathy and outrage. One middle-aged woman offered to help her find what she was looking for, while a man suggested she speak to the manager about Marcus's behavior. Margaret thanked them for their kindness but politely declined their offers, not wanting to cause any more of a scene than had already occurred. What none of them knew, including Marcus himself, was that Margaret Thompson wasn't just another elderly customer looking for a simple gift. She was, in fact, the widow of James Thompson, the man who had founded Henderson's department store 23 years earlier, and she remained the majority shareholder of the business that Marcus was currently mismanaging with his arrogant behavior. Margaret made her way through the store with a heavy heart, trying to focus on finding a gift while processing the shocking encounter she had just experienced. As she browsed through the scarf section, her mind wandered back to the early days, when she and her late husband James had first opened Henderson's department store. Those had been exciting but challenging times, filled with 16-hour workdays, careful attention to every detail, and above all, an unwavering commitment to treating every customer like family. James had been passionate about creating a store where people felt welcome and valued, regardless of their background or the size of their purchase. He would often tell his employees, "Remember, every person who walks through that door is keeping our lights on and putting food on our tables. Treat them with the respect and kindness you'd want for your own mother or grandmother." It had been more than just good business philosophy. It had been a reflection of who James was as a person. After James passed away 5 years earlier, Margaret had made the difficult decision to step back from the day-to-day operations of the store. She had appointed Robert Henderson, James's former assistant manager, to serve as the general manager, trusting him to maintain the values and standards that had made the store successful. She still retained majority ownership of the business, but she preferred to remain in the background, allowing the operational team to run things while she focused on grieving and gradually rebuilding her life without her beloved husband. Margaret rarely visited the store anymore, partly because it brought back too many bittersweet memories and partly because she wanted to give Robert and his team the space they needed to manage things their own way. When she did stop by, it was usually just to pick up something small or to chat briefly with Robert about how things were going. She had always entered through the back office entrance and never spent much time on the main sales floor, which explained why Marcus and most of the newer employees had no idea who she was. As she examined a beautiful silk scarf that would be perfect for her granddaughter, Margaret reflected on how much the retail industry had changed over the decades. She understood that young people today faced different pressures and challenges than her generation had, and she tried to be understanding of their perspectives. However, basic human decency and respect weren't generational issues. They were fundamental aspects of character that transcended age, background, or circumstances. Meanwhile, Marcus had returned to his position behind the counter, feeling satisfied with how he had handled what he saw as an unreasonable customer. In his mind, he had simply been efficient and direct, cutting through what he perceived as unnecessary politeness to get straight to the point. He believed that too many retail workers wasted time coddling customers who should be capable of figuring things out for themselves. Several of his co-workers had witnessed the interaction, and their reactions were mixed. Sarah, a part-time employee who had been with the store for 6 months, felt uncomfortable about how Marcus had spoken to the elderly woman. She had been raised to respect her elders and couldn't understand why he had been so harsh. However, she was relatively new and didn't feel confident enough to confront someone who had been there longer and held a more senior position. David, another sales associate who had been working at Henderson's for almost 2 years, was also troubled by what he had observed. He remembered when the store had a reputation for exceptional customer service, and he had noticed a gradual decline in standards since some of the newer employees had been hired. He had considered speaking to Robert Henderson about the issue several times but had always hesitated, not wanting to seem like he was complaining about his colleagues. As Margaret continued shopping, she overheard conversations between various employees and began to piece together a picture of the store's current culture. It became clear that Marcus's attitude wasn't an isolated incident, but rather part of a broader shift in how some staff members viewed their roles and responsibilities. She heard complaints about customers being too demanding, jokes about older shoppers being clueless, and general discussions that suggested customer service had become secondary to other concerns. The realization deeply saddened Margaret, not just because of how she had been treated, but because it represented a fundamental betrayal of everything she and James had worked to build. Henderson's had been their life's work, their contribution to the community, and their way of creating something meaningful that would outlast their own lives. Seeing it reduced to just another impersonal retail establishment where customers were viewed as inconveniences rather than valued partners was heartbreaking. As she made her way toward the handbag section, Margaret noticed that several customers were sharing similar experiences of poor service and dismissive attitudes from staff members. An elderly gentleman mentioned that he had been made to feel foolish for asking questions about a product. A young mother complained that no one had offered to help her while she struggled to manage her shopping with 2 small children. The pattern was becoming increasingly clear and increasingly troubling. Margaret finally selected a lovely leather handbag and a matching scarf for her granddaughter, items that would have cost her nearly £200. As she prepared to make her purchase, she found herself faced with a decision that would have significant implications for everyone involved. She could simply buy her items and leave, allowing the situation to continue unchanged, or she could take action to address what had clearly become a serious problem with the store's operations and values. The cashier who rang up her purchases was polite and professional, representing the kind of employee that Margaret and James had always valued. This young woman, whose name tag read Emma, was friendly without being overly familiar, efficient without being rushed, and genuinely seemed to care about providing good service. It gave Margaret hope that not all of the store's employees had abandoned the principles that had once defined Henderson's reputation. As she completed her transaction, Margaret made a mental note to remember Emma's name and attitude. If changes were going to be made, it would be important to recognize and reward employees who still embodied the values that mattered. At the same time, it would be necessary to address the attitudes and behaviors that were driving customers away and damaging the store's reputation in the community. Walking toward the exit, Margaret passed by Marcus's station one more time. He was engaged in conversation with another employee, and she couldn't help but overhear him making disparaging comments about difficult customers and old people who don't understand how modern retail works. His words confirmed her growing suspicions about the root cause of the problems she had observed during her visit. Outside the store, Margaret stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, watching people come and go while she processed everything she had experienced. She thought about James and what he would have wanted her to do in this situation. She considered her responsibilities as the majority owner of a business that employed dozens of people and served hundreds of customers each week. Most importantly, she reflected on her own values and what kind of legacy she wanted to leave behind. That evening, Margaret sat in her comfortable sitting room surrounded by photographs and mementos from the decades she had spent building Henderson's with James. The leather handbag and silk scarf she had purchased sat on the coffee table, wrapped beautifully in the store's signature packaging, but her mind was far from thoughts of her granddaughter's upcoming birthday Instead, she found herself wrestling with a decision that would affect not just her own peace of mind, but the livelihoods of everyone connected to the business she still owned. Margaret had always been someone who believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt and addressing problems through conversation and understanding, rather than dramatic confrontations. Her first instinct was to call Robert Henderson and discuss what she had experienced, trusting that he would handle the situation appropriately and ensure that such incidents didn't happen again. However, the more she reflected on what she had witnessed, the more she realized that this wasn't an isolated problem with one rude employee, but rather a symptom of deeper issues within the store's culture and management. She spent the next 2 days quietly conducting her own investigation, calling friends and acquaintances who shopped at Henderson's to ask about their recent experiences. What she discovered was deeply troubling. Multiple people reported similar encounters with dismissive or unhelpful staff members. Several mentioned that they had stopped shopping there regularly because the atmosphere had become unpleasant and unwelcoming. Most concerning of all, she learned that at least 3 longtime customers had taken their business elsewhere entirely after particularly negative experiences. Margaret also reached out to some of the store's former employees, people who had worked there during James's lifetime and had since moved on to other positions. Their accounts painted a picture of gradual decline that had accelerated over the past year. They described changes in hiring practices that seemed to prioritize availability over attitude, training programs that focused on sales targets rather than customer service, and a general shift in culture that had left many of the older employees feeling disconnected from the store's original mission. Armed with this information, Margaret made an appointment to meet with Robert Henderson at his office. She had always liked Robert and respected his dedication to the business, but she was beginning to suspect that he might be overwhelmed by the challenges of modern retail management or perhaps influenced by consultants who didn't understand the store's unique culture and history. When she arrived at the store for her meeting, Margaret chose to enter through the main customer entrance rather than her usual route through the back offices. She wanted to observe the current atmosphere firsthand and see whether her previous visit had been representative of the typical customer experience. Unfortunately, what she witnessed confirmed her worst fears. Marcus was once again stationed at the main information desk, and Margaret watched as he interacted with several customers over the course of 15 minutes. His approach was consistently dismissive and unhelpful. He seemed annoyed by questions, impatient with anyone who needed more than basic directions, and openly rude to an elderly man who was having difficulty understanding the store's return policy. Other staff members either ignored the poor service or seemed to accept it as normal behavior. Margaret felt a deep sadness as she observed the scene. This wasn't the store that she and James had envisioned or worked so hard to create. It had become exactly the kind of impersonal, unwelcoming establishment that they had always tried to compete against. The irony wasn't lost on her that in trying to modernize and streamline operations, Henderson's had lost the very qualities that had made it special and successful in the first place. In Robert's office, Margaret found herself face to face with a man who seemed genuinely surprised by her concerns. Robert had been so focused on managing inventory, controlling costs, and meeting sales targets that he had lost sight of the customer experience that drove everything else. When Margaret described her encounter with Marcus, Robert's immediate response was to dismiss it as an isolated incident involving a usually reliable employee who might have been having a bad day. "Robert," Margaret said gently, "I've been doing some research and I'm afraid this isn't an isolated incident. We have a serious problem with customer service and it's driving people away from the store. That's not just bad for our reputation. It's bad for business and unfair to the employees who are doing their jobs properly." Robert seemed defensive at first, citing the challenges of finding good employees, the pressures of competing with online retailers, and the need to operate efficiently in a difficult economic environment. However, as Margaret shared more specific examples and feedback from customers, his expression gradually changed from skepticism to concern to genuine alarm. "I had no idea things had gotten this bad," he admitted. "I've been so focused on the operational side of things that I haven't been spending enough time on the sales floor. I trusted my supervisors to handle staff training and customer service standards, but it sounds like that trust was misplaced." Margaret appreciated Robert's honesty and willingness to acknowledge the problems, but she was also concerned about his apparent lack of awareness about what was happening in his own store. As the general manager, he should have been more attuned to both employee behavior and customer feedback. His admission suggested that there might be broader management issues that needed to be addressed beyond just dealing with individual problem employees. "What do you think we should do?" Robert asked, genuinely seeking her guidance. "I don't want to overreact, but I also can't let this continue. Henderson's has always prided itself on exceptional customer service, and if we've lost that, we've lost everything that makes us different from our competitors." Margaret had been thinking about this question for days, and she had developed a comprehensive plan that would address both the immediate problems and the underlying issues that had allowed them to develop. However, she also knew that implementing real change would require more than just policy adjustments or staff meetings. It would require a fundamental recommitment to the values and standards that had originally made Henderson successful. "I think we need to start by honestly assessing every aspect of our customer service approach," Margaret said. "That means spending time on the sales floor, talking to customers about their experiences, and having frank conversations with employees about expectations and standards. We also need to look at our hiring and training processes to make sure we're bringing in people who understand and embrace our commitment to customer service." Robert nodded thoughtfully, but Margaret could see that he was still processing the scope of what would be required. She realized that he might need more support and guidance than she had originally anticipated, and she began to consider whether she needed to become more actively involved in the store's operations, at least temporarily, to ensure that necessary changes were implemented effectively. "There's something else we need to discuss," Margaret continued. "The employee I encountered, Marcus, I believe his name was, his behavior was completely unacceptable, and it's apparently not the first time. We need to address that situation directly and make it clear that such conduct won't be tolerated going forward." As they continued their conversation, Margaret found herself remembering why she and James had originally decided to open their own store rather than work for someone else. They had wanted to create a business that reflected their values and treated both customers and employees with dignity and respect. Somewhere along the way, Henderson's had lost sight of those fundamental principles, but Margaret was determined to help restore them, no matter what it took. The following Monday morning, Margaret arrived at Henderson's department store earlier than she had in years. She had made a decision over the weekend that surprised even herself. She was going to spend several days working directly in the store, observing operations firsthand, and interacting with both customers and employees to get a complete picture of the current situation. It was time to stop relying on reports and secondhand information and start seeing things with her own eyes. Margaret had asked Robert to introduce her to the staff simply as Mrs. Thompson, a consultant working with management to improve customer service. This approach would allow her to observe natural behavior without the complications that might arise if employees knew she was the actual owner. She wanted to see how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching, as that would give her the most accurate assessment of the store's real culture. Her first day was eye-opening in ways she hadn't expected. While Marcus and a few others maintained their dismissive attitudes toward customers, Margaret discovered that many employees were genuinely frustrated with the declining service standards, but felt powerless to change things. Several staff members confided in her that they had tried to address problems with colleagues or supervisors, only to be told that customer complaints were inevitable in retail and that they shouldn't worry about isolated incidents. Emma, the cashier who had served Margaret during her first visit, was particularly helpful in explaining the dynamics among the staff. During a brief conversation during Emma's break, she revealed that there were essentially two groups of employees: those who cared about providing good service and took pride in their work, and those who viewed their jobs as temporary inconveniences and treated customers accordingly. The problem was that the second group seemed to set the tone for the store's overall atmosphere. "It's really frustrating," Emma explained. "Some of us try to maintain high standards, but when customers see other employees being rude or unhelpful, they assume that's how the whole store operates. And honestly, it's getting harder to stay motivated when you feel like you're fighting a losing battle every day." Margaret was struck by Emma's insight and passion for doing good work. Here was exactly the kind of employee that she and James had always valued, someone who understood that customer service wasn't just a job requirement, but a reflection of personal character and professional pride. It gave her hope that the store's problems were fixable if the right leadership and support were provided. Over the course of the week, Margaret observed Marcus's interactions with dozens of customers. His pattern of behavior was remarkably consistent. Dismissive responses to questions, visible annoyance when asked to provide assistance, and a general attitude that suggested customers were interrupting more important work. She watched him make a young mother feel stupid for asking about return policies, dismiss an elderly man's concerns about product quality, and actually roll his eyes when a teenager asked for help finding a specific item. What troubled Margaret, even more than Marcus's individual behavior, was the way other employees had normalized it. Some staff members seemed uncomfortable with his approach but were reluctant to intervene or report problems. Others had apparently adopted similar attitudes, creating a culture where poor customer service was becoming increasingly common and accepted. A few employees like Emma and David continued to provide excellent service, but they were clearly in the minority. Margaret also spent time talking to customers about their experiences shopping at Henderson's. Many shared stories similar to her own encounter with Marcus, instances of rudeness, unhelpfulness, or outright hostility from staff members. Several mentioned that they continued shopping there primarily out of habit or convenience, but that they no longer recommended the store to friends or family members. Most concerning of all, she met 3 different customers who were actively looking for alternative places to shop because they had grown tired of the poor service. By Thursday, Margaret had seen enough to confirm that drastic action was necessary. The problems weren't limited to 1 or 2 employees, but had become systemic issues that threatened the store's reputation and financial viability. She scheduled a meeting with Robert for Friday afternoon to discuss her findings and recommendations, but she also decided that she needed to address the Marcus situation immediately and directly. Friday morning presented Margaret with the perfect opportunity when she witnessed Marcus's most egregious behavior yet. A well-dressed woman in her 50s approached his station, asking for help finding a wedding gift for her daughter. Instead of offering assistance, Marcus responded with exaggerated sighs and complaints about how busy he was. When the woman persisted, explaining that she wasn't familiar with current fashion trends and really needed guidance, Marcus's response was shocking even by his usual standards. "Look, I'm not a personal shopper, and this isn't a charity," he said loudly enough for nearby customers to hear. "Figure it out yourself or go somewhere else if you can't handle basic shopping. I've got real work to do here." The woman was clearly hurt and embarrassed by the public humiliation. Several other customers stopped what they were doing to stare, and Margaret could see the exact moment when the woman decided she would never shop at Henderson's again. As the customer walked toward the exit, Margaret made her decision. It was time to reveal her true identity and take direct action. Margaret approached Marcus's station with a calm but determined expression. She had spent decades in business and had dealt with difficult employees before, but this situation required a particularly careful approach. She needed to be firm and clear about unacceptable behavior, while also maintaining the professional standards that she expected from everyone in the organization, including herself. "Excuse me, Marcus," she said in a voice that was quiet but carried unmistakable authority. "I need to speak with you privately for a moment." Marcus looked up with the same annoyed expression he had been showing customers all week. "I already told you I'm busy with important stuff. Whatever consulting thing you're working on can wait." "Actually, it can't wait," Margaret replied, her tone remaining calm but becoming noticeably firmer. "And I think you'll find that what I have to say is quite important. Please step into the office with me for a few minutes." Something in Margaret's demeanor must have registered with Marcus, because he reluctantly followed her into the small office behind the customer service counter. Once the door was closed, Margaret turned to face him directly, her expression serious but not angry. "Marcus, I've been observing your interactions with customers for several days now, and I need to be very clear about something. The way you've been treating people is completely unacceptable and needs to stop immediately." Marcus's reaction was predictably defensive. "Who are you to tell me how to do my job? You're just some consultant that Robert brought in. I've been working here longer than you've even known this place existed." Margaret took a deep breath and looked Marcus directly in the eyes. "Actually, Marcus, I think there's something you should know about who I really am and why your behavior is about to have consequences you haven't considered." Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a small leather folder that contained documents Marcus had never seen before. As she opened it, she spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades building and running successful businesses. "Marcus, my name is Margaret Thompson. My late husband, James Thompson, founded Henderson's department store 23 years ago, and I remain the majority owner of this business. I'm not a consultant, I'm your employer, and I've been watching your behavior all week." The color drained from Marcus's face as the implications of her words sank in. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. Margaret could see him rapidly replaying every interaction they had shared over the past several days, realizing with growing horror how badly he had misjudged the situation. "That's impossible," he finally stammered. "You're just some old lady who doesn't understand how retail works. Robert would have told us if the owner was here." Margaret calmly showed him the incorporation documents that listed her as the primary shareholder, along with a letter from the store's attorney confirming her authority to make operational decisions. "Robert didn't know I was conducting this observation because I wanted to see how the store really operates when management isn't watching. Unfortunately, what I've discovered is deeply troubling." As the reality of his situation became clear, Marcus's attitude shifted from defiance to panic. "Look, Mrs. Thompson, maybe I've been having some bad days lately. The job is stressful, and sometimes customers can be really difficult. I didn't mean anything personal by the way I talked to people." "Marcus," Margaret said firmly, "let me be very clear about something. The woman you were rude to on Monday, that was me. You told me to figure things out myself and suggested I leave if I didn't like the way things were done here. You called me old woman and refused to provide basic customer service. That wasn't a bad day. That was a choice you made about how to treat people." The full weight of what had happened began to dawn on Marcus. Not only had he been consistently rude to the actual owner of the store, but he had done so while she was evaluating the overall quality of customer service. His attempts to justify his behavior suddenly seemed pathetically inadequate. "I can explain," he said desperately. "I've been working really hard, and sometimes the pressure gets to me. I know I can do better if you just give me another chance. I really need this job." Margaret studied his face for a moment, looking for signs of genuine remorse or understanding. What she saw instead was someone who was sorry he had been caught, not someone who truly grasped why his behavior was wrong or harmful to others. "Marcus, this isn't about pressure or bad days. This is about fundamental respect for other human beings. I've watched you treat elderly customers like they're stupid, dismiss people who needed help, and create an atmosphere that drives business away from this store. That's not acceptable under any circumstances." Margaret paused and walked to the small window that looked out onto the sales floor. She could see Emma helping a customer find the right size dress, taking time to offer suggestions and answer questions with a genuine smile. David was assisting a family with young children, patiently explaining product features while keeping the kids entertained. These employees understood what customer service meant. "Here's what's going to happen," Margaret continued, turning back to face Marcus. "Your employment with Henderson's department store ends today. You'll be paid through the end of this week, but you won't be returning to work here. Robert will provide you with information about unemployment benefits and job placement services." Marcus's face went through a range of emotions: shock, anger, disbelief, and finally a desperate attempt to negotiate. "You can't fire me for having a couple of bad interactions with customers. I've got rights and I'll sue if you try to get rid of me unfairly." Margaret remained calm in the face of his threats. "Marcus, I've documented numerous instances of unprofessional behavior over the past week alone. I have witness statements from customers and other employees. Your termination is well within legal bounds and is necessary to protect both our customers and our business reputation." "This isn't fair," Marcus shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "I work hard here, and just because some old people can't handle the real world doesn't mean I should lose my job. You don't understand what it's like dealing with these people every day." Margaret felt a flash of anger at his continued disrespect, but she controlled her response carefully. "Marcus, the fact that you're still referring to customers as these people and blaming them for your own poor behavior tells me that termination is absolutely the right decision. You don't understand what customer service means, and you're not willing to learn." As Margaret prepared to leave the office and ask Robert to handle the administrative details of Marcus's termination, she reflected on how different this conversation might have been if Marcus had shown genuine remorse and a willingness to change. She had always believed in giving people second chances when they demonstrated real understanding of their mistakes and commitment to improvement. However, Marcus had shown no such growth or insight. "Before I go," Margaret said, "I want you to understand something important. This store employs dozens of people who work hard every day to provide good service and support their families. Your behavior doesn't just reflect poorly on you, it affects everyone who works here and everyone who shops here. When you treat customers badly, you're damaging something that a lot of people care deeply about." Marcus sat in stunned silence as Margaret gathered her documents and prepared to leave. The reality of losing his job was starting to sink in, along with the humiliation of discovering that he had spent a week being rude to the person who ultimately controlled his employment. As Margaret opened the office door, she turned back one final time. "I genuinely hope you learn from this experience, Marcus. Retail work isn't beneath anyone who does it with pride and professionalism. The problem wasn't your job, it was your attitude toward the people you were supposed to serve." Margaret walked back onto the sales floor, where several employees had noticed the commotion and were watching nervously. She made a mental note to address their concerns and ensure that Marcus's departure was handled professionally and discreetly. There would be important conversations ahead about expectations, training, and the kind of culture she wanted to rebuild at Henderson's. But first, she needed to find Robert and begin the process of making the changes that would restore her store to the standard of excellence that she and James had originally envisioned. The confrontation with Marcus was over, but the real work of rebuilding Henderson's reputation and culture was just beginning. 6 months after the dramatic confrontation that led to Marcus's termination, Henderson's department store had undergone a remarkable transformation. Margaret had decided to take a more active role in the business, not as a daily manager, but as a guiding presence who ensured that the values she and James had established remained at the heart of everything the store did. The changes began immediately after Marcus's departure. Margaret worked closely with Robert to completely overhaul the store's hiring and training processes. Instead of focusing primarily on availability and basic qualifications, they developed a comprehensive system that evaluated candidates' attitudes toward customer service, their ability to work as part of a team, and their understanding of what it meant to represent the Henderson's brand. Emma, the cashier who had impressed Margaret with her professionalism and genuine care for customers, was promoted to customer service supervisor. Her first task was to work with Margaret and Robert to create a training program that went far beyond teaching employees about products and procedures. The new program emphasized the importance of treating every customer as a valued individual, understanding that exceptional service was what differentiated Henderson's from larger chain stores and online retailers. The transformation wasn't without its challenges. 2 other employees who had adopted attitudes similar to Marcus's chose to leave rather than adapt to the new expectations. Initially, some staff members were nervous about the changes, worried that the increased focus on customer service would make their jobs more difficult or stressful. However, as they began to see the positive results of their efforts, most employees embraced the new culture enthusiastically. Margaret instituted several programs that had never existed during the store's earlier years. She created a customer feedback system that allowed shoppers to easily share both compliments and complaints about their experiences. Positive feedback was shared with the entire staff and recognized publicly, while concerns were addressed promptly and thoroughly. She also established a monthly recognition program that highlighted employees who went above and beyond in serving customers. Perhaps most importantly, Margaret began spending several hours each week working directly in the store, not as an owner, checking up on employees, but as someone who genuinely enjoyed interacting with customers and supporting her staff. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the store's values and provided employees with immediate access to guidance and support when they faced challenging situations. The results of these changes were dramatic and swift. Customer complaints dropped to nearly zero within 2 months. Sales began to increase as word spread through the community that Henderson's had returned to its reputation for exceptional service. Several customers who had stopped shopping there during the period of decline returned and brought friends with them. Emma proved to be an excellent choice for the supervisor position. She had a natural ability to coach and encourage other employees, and her enthusiasm for providing great service was contagious. Under her leadership, the customer service team developed a genuine camaraderie and shared commitment to excellence. That was obvious to anyone who spent time in the store. Robert, freed from having to constantly address customer complaints and staff conflicts, was able to focus on the operational aspects of the business that he handled well. He worked with Margaret to modernize inventory systems, improve product selection, and streamline processes in ways that enhanced rather than detracted from the customer experience. Their partnership proved to be highly effective, combining his operational expertise with her understanding of customer service and business values. One particularly meaningful moment came when Margaret encountered the well-dressed woman who had been humiliated by Marcus months earlier. The customer had decided to give Henderson's another chance after hearing from friends that the store had improved dramatically. When she recognized Margaret as the person who had intervened during her unpleasant encounter with Marcus, she was amazed to learn that the woman who had stood up for her was actually the store's owner. "I can't believe you were there that day and saw how badly I was treated," the customer said. "And then you actually did something about it. That means more to me than you'll ever know. It shows that you really care about your customers as people, not just as sources of revenue." Margaret was also pleased to discover that the changes at Henderson's had attracted positive attention from other local business owners. Several retail establishments had reached out to ask about her approach to customer service training and employee development. She was happy to share what she had learned, believing that improving service standards throughout the community would benefit everyone. The story of Marcus's termination had spread through the local retail community, serving as a cautionary tale about the importance of treating customers with respect, regardless of their age, appearance, or perceived status. Some employees at other stores had shared that hearing about what happened at Henderson's had caused them to reflect on their own attitudes and behaviors toward customers. As Margaret looked back on the events that had led to the store's transformation, she realized that her painful encounter with Marcus had ultimately been a blessing in disguise. It had forced her to confront problems that she might otherwise have ignored or addressed too gradually. The crisis had created an opportunity for positive change that might not have existed under less dramatic circumstances. The store was now thriving in ways that exceeded even Margaret's expectations. Sales were higher than they had been in years, employee turnover had dropped significantly, and customer satisfaction scores were consistently excellent. More importantly, Henderson's had reclaimed its reputation as a business that truly cared about the people it served. On quiet afternoons, Margaret would sometimes stand in the same spot where Marcus had been so rude to her months earlier, watching. Emma and her team provide the kind of service that made customers feel valued and appreciated. She would think about James and how proud he would be to see that their life's work had not only survived, but had emerged stronger and more committed to its founding principles. The transformation of Henderson's department store served as a powerful reminder that businesses are ultimately about people, the employees who represent the company's values, and the customers who trust those employees with their time, money, and respect. When that fundamental truth is honored and protected, success follows naturally. When it's forgotten or abandoned, even the most established businesses can quickly lose their way. Margaret had learned that sometimes the most important business decisions come from the most unexpected circumstances, and that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult or uncomfortable, is essential for maintaining the integrity that makes a business truly worth preserving.